Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome back to SFC's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing SFC for the first time, we're an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals who believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Students for Canada if you want to learn more about what we do. Today, we are hosting Lynn Exner, COO of Canada Action, a resource advocacy organization. Lynn is here to talk about her experience at the recent CERA conference in Houston, Texas. Specifically, she will be addressing the current concerns of global leaders in energy, geopolitics, and technology. So we'll have a ton of questions for you, Lynn. Before I hand the floor over to Lynn, please know that attendees are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom, which we will address at the end of the session. I will now share the spotlight with our guest. Welcome, Lynn.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, SFC. It's great to be back. And maybe, Lyndon, I'll get you to share the screen whenever you feel ready. But to start, I had a unique privilege last week of going to the world's most probably important energy conference. It's called CERAWeek. It's been held for 30 years, but it is a mixture of geopolitics, technology, and energy of all forms. So next slide, please, Lyndon. So I had the pleasure, as I said, of going to CERAWeek in Houston last year. And this is a mixture of there's 6,000 people from 87 countries, over 50 senior ministers from the president of Nicaragua to Canada's own natural resources minister, Wilkinson. There are over 120 startups from places like MIT, Stanford, and other global leaders in all forms of energy, and literally global experts in geopolitics, global supply chains, global finance, and energy innovation. And so I had this great fortunate time to just spend hours and hours for the full week talking to a lot of real global experts on this, and wanted to bring back to SFC some of the main concepts that were brought up, because so often what we discuss here is that we're actually, we're beholden to our journalists to tell us what's going on. And what I thought was really interesting about this is that it was the people who are actually sitting at the tables, making these discussions, coming up with these innovations, talking about what they saw were the challenges and opportunities available. So I wanted to share that with you. Next slide, please. I would say of all the things that I heard at CERAWeek, that the most important was that how we define the problem will determine the solutions we come up with. That was my number one takeaway. And it's something that I know that Students for Canada has talked about. And so instead of framing it as this is that, we have to get rid of fossil fuels problem, this is a megaton emission problem. Instead of this is a Russia problem, this is an energy security problem. So the discussion the whole way through was about how do we frame a problem in the right format. And then furthermore, kind of to the end of the conversation, is that if you are not addressing sort of all these major issues of money, of jobs, of supply chain, of the human aspect of how we solve this larger energy problem, then you're not actually solving for the problem. You're just kind of doing a part of it. So that was the big takeaway, is that whether you are whether you are a politician or whether you are doing carbon upcycling, a great startup based out of Calgary of young University of Calgarians, you need to be contemplating all these things. Next slide, please, Lyndon. So one of the first problems is the one that has been top of mind for the past many years, is emissions, right? So we've been talking about emissions and Paris and getting to the 1.5 degrees. And so this was, of course, still a very major part here. But the framing of the problem was this is about reducing emissions overall. So instead of just choosing one thing to vilify, or even saying, oh, well, even if you get into nuclear or wind, there's also emissions there. It was just talking about how do we get rid of our emissions overall. So there were some big pieces here, and I'm not going to get into this, there's no time today, but there was three major hubs. And the three things they're focusing on this year, which I think is interesting, is hydrogen, not yet commercialized or anything else, but a big piece kind of going forward. Carbon management is sort of the space we're in right now, where there's a lot of discussion that without carbon management and sequestration, nothing else can go forward. And then kind of looking not so much backwards, but like when we talked about the innovations around wind and solar, the big barriers, of course, is batteries and storage. So a lot of great things to talk about at that point. Another thing that we were discussing, or that I heard talked about by these experts, was that this has to be an and problem, not an or problem. The biggest push I heard was let's get away from the binary of one is good and another one is bad. We're going to need all these different things, but we have to talk about those components. Another big thing significantly different this year is that up until now, the focus has been primarily on sustainability. And a big shift was that we have not focus on reliability, affordability, accessibility, and especially most recently, security. So those will come back on, and how will they impact the very important work being done around reducing emissions. So a lot of different pieces around the megaton problem. And I think one thing that was discussed also, although it wasn't the purview of this conference to discuss, is why are we not talking more about emissions from outside of energy? Why is it that we are almost exclusively talking about energy? And how can we spread out that conversation? Because again, it's a megaton problem and we cannot afford to pick winners and losers. So that would be one thing to frame it as, is to kind of give that context. Next slide. The second thing that really kind of hit for him, this was a phrase that was commonly heard. I think one person kind of started it off, it might have even been John Kerry, who is the ambassador for climate from the United States, you might have heard of. And it was like, this is the gigawatt problem. And so what we mean by that is the amount of energy that's needed. Let's not talk about emissions, but just the need for accessible, reliable, affordable, secure energy. That demand is growing. 7 billion people on the planet right now, 1 billion aren't even in the conversation. They don't have access to reliable energy of any sort. And we expect another 2 billion more by the time we get to that 2050 net zero targets. And when energy is available, quality of life everywhere improves. But the amount of energy that's required for this is in the gigawatts. And I think as a former science teacher, people have no idea how big a gigawatt is. You know, when you think of your 60-watt light bulb, and to get to a gigawatt, we're talking about the energy required for millions of homes. And so just the scale of energy that we need is huge. As we get into the Internet of Things and electrification of everything, the energy requirements will be more and more. And how do we balance that with the first problem, which of course is emissions? Next slide. So one guy had a really interesting sort of approach. He was from S&P Global, very well known and understood sort of consulting firm. And so he said, if you think about the world as world incorporated, you know, when you break it into 4 different things, and I apologize, the slide is a little bit dark, but if you say, okay, one category is emerging economies versus developed economies, and then we have old energy, primarily fossil fuels, and then new energy. And he said, if you were the president of World Incorporated, you would see that you're putting almost all of our dollars into new energy in developed economies. And that if that was a business, that you might look at it and say, why is that all we're doing? And one of the examples that was listed is, for example, when you take coal plants, it's pretty well accepted worldwide we need to get off of coal. But what if we could reduce the emissions of a coal plant significantly by 20, 50, 80%? That is reducing in a tangible way right now what the emissions are, even if they're still operating a coal plant. And we're ignoring those opportunities to focus on how we can clean up energy as opposed to create a whole new infrastructure for new energy. And then a lot of discussion around new and emerging economies. Can we get them to skip over this whole fossil fuel phase of energy, which people are very much working on? And then furthermore, when you get to developed economies with old energy, Alberta would be a great example of that. In that context, how do you continue to allocate any funds to that with a huge policy focus and ESG? So those are big questions too. Next slide. Moving right along, this is one of the ones going back to scale. I've said megaton, I've said gigawatt, and then now here's a very big number. And it's $4 trillion, which is effectively the amount of money that we expect that the global economy is going to drop into climate action and energy security, less so energy security, over the next 20 years annually. And I know that this is a hard number. You just see 3 extra zeros, but just for context, if you had $1 million in $100 bills, the height of that stack of $1 million would be about the size of my chair behind me. If you were to change that to $1 billion, that stack of bills would be the height of the highest building in the world in Dubai. And if you had $1 trillion, that's like stacking it up to the solar system and going another 2.5 times beyond that. Like, the number is enormous. And I think people really lack that sense of scale. $4 trillion lined up side to side could literally go from here to the sun and back, 1.5 times. Like, it's a huge number. So why does that matter? The scale is enormous. And how are we going to, with that amount of money, where does the money come from? There's no way governments can afford to do this. Private sector is imperative. In Canada, we talk a lot about how are we going to decarbonize, and should we do subsidizing for these large fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies, energy companies, and that isn't the way to go forward. But it's simply impossible for governments to pay for the transition and the new technology and the step ups without private sector. So that was one big piece. The second thing is a lot of bankers from a lot of the major banks saying the system simply is not built to allocate these funds in a proper way. Because they're designed for risk aversion to retain economics. And so how do you go into a newer emerging place which doesn't have those pieces? Other things are things like commercialization and economics. Even if this is the way the system is built, is how do you get things to scale? Like it's great if you have a great idea in the lab, but it's not useful if you can't get it to scale, if the economics can't get done, and then furthermore, if people don't want it. Other issues that we discussed is with this much money, is there transparency? Is there equal opportunity for different places? Or is this an elite situation where elite groups fund other elite companies and that's where the money goes? And the other question, of course, that comes up is where do we spend this enormous amount of money on? Is it infrastructure? Building new wind farms, solar plants, nuclear plants, pipelines? Is it on just transition for communities that maybe were coal communities that no longer going to produce coal, and you want to help support those people that have lost their jobs to get re-educated and compensate them for paying a big price for the emissions that we all burn? Is the money going to innovation, which is where the majority of it goes right now? Does it go to subsidies? So a lot of big questions. Next slide. Another thing that came up time and time again, I kind of alluded to it now, but really the phrase that, the energy problem, the energy transition is about jobs. The transition can and will not occur in any jurisdiction if the jobs that are displaced by the current paradigm do not get transferred at the same sort of time and place. So you can't say, oh, well, you're losing your job now, but 30 years later, 2,000 miles away, there will be jobs that will be created. And so it's bridging that gap that is a big problem. And a lot of discussion, especially around, more vulnerable communities and human rights conversations that were happening from a political standpoint. How much money should go not into innovation, which sounds pretty exciting when you decide that you want to build small modular reactors, or you're going to build a way to do methane pyrolysis and capture all the carbon. But how do we put money into and justify money going to small communities that are going to be in many ways decimated or turned into ghost towns? So that's a big concern all around the world. Next. This was a question that someone asked, and it just, of course, stuck with me. And somebody in the United States, actually, I think based out of Oklahoma, said, what happens? Does protesting a pipeline stop a solar farm? And so the conversation around that was that, when it comes to energy, there is a common problem, and that is getting infrastructure built. So whether it's offshore wind, whether it's large solar farms, whether it's a pipeline, across Canada and any of the directions we're talking about right now, it's a hardware problem. It's not a software problem where you can change technology just with electrons. You actually have to build these things. And the problem that I heard across the entire world is regulations and permitting slows things down. The only standing ovation that was given at the whole thing was when the Secretary of Energy, Granholm, spoke up and said, we're going to work on reducing the time to get things done, to get things approved. And there was a standing ovation from everybody across all these countries, because that's a big thing. Local opposition. So even if it's an idea that sounds really good, the sort of NIMBYism, if there's local opposition, as we've seen in Canada, a small group of people that don't want it in their community can cause a huge amount of delays. And that also causes uncertainty, which just stops projects. And I'm not talking just oil and gas pipelines. I'm saying it takes 7 years in Germany to get a wind farm built. So that's Germany, that's wind, and that's sort of their whole push has been there. And so going back to the megaton problem and the gigawatt issue, how can we address those things if we don't have a pace that's keeping up with the problem to implement any of these solutions? Abu Dhabi has actually expanded. Of course, they're well known for being one of the world's greatest gas suppliers. But as it turns out, they have a whole parallel version of wind and solar. They're operating in 42 different countries. And the CEO from that organization, he said, when I go into different places to try to create offshore wind, the permitting and everything that happens, the work with the local jobs, all these different pieces that people think, oh, great, we'll just do wind. And he's trying, and he said sometimes it can take him 7 years and you can get to year 6 and then projects simply fall off. So this is the problem. And then going back to the title, one of the things that was discussed was that we should stop, full stop, protesting infrastructure, because humans, the way that we behave is if we start getting used to protesting, for example, in Canada, pipelines. Well, what if in the future we want a hydrogen pipeline? Because hydrogen is the new clean fuel. But the humans in Canada have been taught that pipelines are bad and that's what they've been taught. So how does that lead to, okay, we can always stop this? Or people see how you stop a pipeline and someone doesn't want a solar farm in their space, which happens. France, for example, they said, we're big on nuclear. We're okay with a lot of things, but you will never, this is the guy from Total Energies. He's like, yeah, you're not going to get wind or solar on a Parisian landscape. He's like, they just won't stand for the visual effect, was sort of what he said. So there's all these different issues. Next slide. So another big issue is that of supply chains. And this, of course, has become a bigger deal through COVID, where we've seen that different countries have become globally dependent on supply chains. We've also seen the strength of that same thing, where global cooperation on the solution for a vaccine in COVID got us really some miracle vaccines very quickly. But one of the things is that, we're talking very much about the supply chain of gas, given the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and how that whole supply chain is having all this kind of fallout. Some of the fallouts for that one example is that when you haven't got that gas, never mind the energy security, that means there's no fertilizer in Europe. And when there's no fertilizer in Europe, the food security in Europe is gone. And Egypt gets 80% of its wheat from Russia and Belarus. Well, ask yourself what you think is going to happen if Egypt suddenly has only 20% of the wheat they're used to getting. And does that contribute to global security? And what other problems could come from that? Or if you don't get any gas to Brazil so they can use fertilizer, Brazil provides, 75% of the world's corn, which is used in every kind of sugary thing that you need, plus food, and as a byproduct for a lot of different diesels and biofuels. So there's a big spillover of the supply chains. Like, we don't all have all the things. And so that was a really big discussion. One of the biggest one, in particular in the areas talking about wind and solar and electrification of the power grid, was copper. And there was an entire session on copper. And one guy said that the 10 biggest mines in the world, average age is 100 years old. We don't build new copper mines. And to build one, it basically takes about 13 years to get it built. And the newest one is being built in Mongolia, which is very remote. So it's going to take a long time. And there, the new copper is going to China. And you have to ask yourself, is that where we want our supply to come from? And going back to the top point here, when we say we don't want to be dependent on one country for their oil and their gas, what we might be doing, and this is a real concern, especially for the executives and people in wind and solar, is that they're worried that their whole industry is built on these rare earths and critical minerals that are very much controlled in Russia and China. There's a lot in Vietnam and Indonesia as well. But from a NATO perspective, there's very few of those. So these are real concerns that they have practically of, I will not be able to scale up my industry if we don't figure out how to have a better, secure access to these rare earths and minerals. And I think that we talked about this at another session, that that creates a whole other security issue because they're concentrated in fewer countries. Next slide. So then there's the Canadian content, and one of the things that I don't want to spend too much time on today, but the reality is, the world doesn't all have all the things, but frankly, Canada pretty much does. We kind of have all the things. We have this beautiful blessing and abundance of resources, which gets back to the work I do at Canada Action. The world needs more Canadian resources. We've been saying that for 12 years. And it really is true. And so our problem here in Canada, of course, as always, and there's a real spotlight on it now, is our trouble getting our product to market. The world would love our LNG. We can't get it to market. And one of the things that came up, this was a separate conversation I had with a woman from the Czech Republic. And it was just an offhand anecdotal thing. So I can't say that it's, of a broader thing, but she just said to me, she's like, Canada, she said, I just find it so surprisingly un-Canadian that you guys refuse to share your oil and gas. And not spending much time outside of Canada, especially during COVID, I have to say I was very surprised to hear that she thought it was un-Canadian for us to hoard and not share this. And then in a different conversation, we talked about, again, copper mines. Papua New Guinea is another place that it has a great copper opportunity. The locals there don't want it. People are like, well, we need this for electrification. And they're like, we don't care. We here locally don't want that to happen. So when can we impose on a community that you might not like it, it might not suit your sensibilities, but other people might need this further? Let's move on to the next slide just for time here. So ultimately, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is there was a big discussion that these are human problems. This is not just an innovation, solve it in a lab. One comment talking about security and frankly in China, this one guy from China, he just said, when we look at, as Chinese, we look at United States, and this became a theme across other people, just the nature of the conference. He's like, your entire country is run by lawyers. He said, our country is run by engineers. And there's just a complete different look at that. And that has nothing to do with the big picture problem. That just says that the solutions, again, how you're defining the problem as lawyers or engineers. And then the joke was that's the difference between Washington and Houston, or that's the difference between Ottawa and Calgary. And one is not better than the other. It's just a different way of looking at the problem. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is another big piece, which again, in Canada, we don't want pipelines. And there's a lot of reasons people might feel one way or the other on that. But you have Europe right now that is really wishing that we had pipelines and LNG plants. And so do we have a right to impose as Canadians on other countries that they should do development, or do other countries have a right to ask of us to do the same here if we have local resistance? So those are some examples there. Next slide. I think it's almost last. And then the last piece that I'm not a geopolitical expert, but I will say it was fascinating to sit there and listen to literally global experts on geopolitics. The main person who was leading all this was for many years United States ambassador to the Ukraine. They had the leading expert from America's perspective anyway, on studying Putin and sort of his leadership style, technique, rationale. We had people from all different kind of countries talking about this. And I will say the one takeaway for me is that this is bigger and more serious and scarier than, I think the closer you get to it, the scarier they seem. It seemed terrifying, really. And they said, this is the end of the Cold War era. Like, the world has changed. And the last time we had an era change, which was the, post-Cold War, it wasn't a war. That was, when the Berlin Wall fell, there were not people that were dying. It was not a big, huge war of bloodshed. And so people have forgotten what this looks like. And that's going to change everything. Where now, one of the jokes was that ESG, instead of environmental, social and governance, has changed. And I want to be clear, this was kind of as a joke, but tongue in cheek. And they're like, it's just ESG now is energy security guaranteed. And so the big battle we're going to have as a world is, how do we balance sustainability, which we've identified as being imperative, with energy security? And given inflation, everything else right now, accessibility and affordability, because when you have people that are paying twice as much at the pumps and making decisions over food or fuel, that simply doesn't work. And then a lot of great discussions about things that I hadn't contemplated, how this shifts everything, what the effect is, that we've now moved from the Iran nuclear agreement has now become, they're looking to be an ally. So we're working hard to work with Iran because of what's going on here. NATO, which was largely not doing a lot for a long time, has been strengthened. And so what happens with that? There was a big pivot from the Middle East, away from the Middle East that you might have noticed, United States and from Western communities. What happens now? A big discussion about Africa that I have you talk about, a discussion about why is China sitting this one out. And one expert suggested that China's relationship with Taiwan as a sovereign country that believes that this, is theirs because it once was, is very parallel to what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and that would be a big significant thing. So just a whole bunch of different conversations. Last slide, please. So the takeaway that we heard, and this was not my synopsis, but this was from the two gentlemen who started the CERAWeek conference years ago, one of whom is a Pulitzer Prize winner, Daniel Yergin, and his partner. And it was from their seat, where they are consulting with and for world leaders in all these things all the time, having these private conversations and in back rooms. And when they came and they gave their address, the big thing for them was that, of course, what we all know is we need to focus on innovation, cooperation, common ground. The greatest thing about this conference was that bipartisan politics, however that looks in any country, because it exists all over the place, was really put aside. And so those first three things were done. But the big thing that they said is that whenever we're looking at solutions going forward on energy, silos are no longer available. You can't just think of oil and gas. You can't just think of financing. They all have to work together. And if you're not addressing all these problems, if you don't have a good answer for all of them, whenever you're creating something, it simply isn't a viable solution. It's a non-starter. So takeaways from some of the world's greatest brains. And I just had the privilege of listening to them and reporting back to you. Thanks for letting me share some of those highlights.